My name is John Kenyon. I'm the director of the City of Literature and the Book Festival. I'd like to thank you for coming this morning. Thank you for adjusting your calendars. It has been kind of an interesting last couple of days as we accommodate what will surely be one of the more interesting days in Iowa City's history. But I do appreciate all of you coming out and know that you'll have the opportunity to get off to other things later. The panel discussions that we have on the Fridays of the Iowa City Book Festival are some of my favorite events that we always have. It's wonderful for us to be able to partner with the International Writing Program. The panels that they do all throughout the fall are always wonderful, but we always hold a special place in our hearts for this one because it allows us to, again, strengthen those ties between the Book Festival and this wonderful program. So thank you for that. I will say that we have about 36 more events between now and the end of the festival. So you have ample opportunity to take in things, including a number of panel discussions that will be at the Masonic Building, which is a half block to the east, tomorrow morning and afternoon, that will feature some IWP writers as well. So you have a lot of opportunity to check those folks out, as well as a number of authors that we've brought to town for the festival. So without further delay, I'd like to introduce Chris Merrill with the IWP to introduce the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, John, and thank you to the Iowa City Public Library for making this space available to us on Fridays. Speaking freely. It is good news that we had to push this panel forward an hour in order to avoid Greta Thunberg's noontime call to action on climate change, since it makes clear that even in this dark time, the First Amendment freedoms guaranteed in the U.S. Constitution of religion, expression, assembly, and petition retain their hold on the public imagination. Civil society depends upon the right of every individual to protest grave wrongdoings. Go Greta, and the suggested estimate that 14,000 people will be in our downtown in the next hour or so. No one understands the right to speak freely better than a writer, for the very definition of a literary figure calling depends upon speech being free. Yet this freedom is understood and valued very differently across historical moments, cultures, and contexts. The concept of hate speech stands in sharp contradiction to that of freedom of expression. What is a writer's responsibility in the domain between these two poles? To take two examples from countries represented on this panel. In an editorial in the New York Times, Duncan White noted yesterday that the Turkish strongman, Recep Tayyip Erdogan's education minister, recently boasted of having removed more than 300,000 books from schools and libraries and destroyed them, while the People's Republic of China has in the last decade banned, quote, nearly all bookstores, books, authors, and academics that do not adhere to the Communist Party line, close quote. White also argues that the Trump administration's tepid response to the murder and dismemberment of the Saudi critic Jamal Khashoggi, the first anniversary of which we commemorated this week, quote, is just the most egregious example of why the global defense of freedom of the press and speech is no longer an American priority, which is why it falls to writers to articulate once again why we must find ways to speak freely. And that is what we can expect of the distinguished writers on our panel today. They are, from my left to right, Tade Ipediola received the 2013 Nigerian Prize for Literature for his poetry collection, The Sahara Testaments, which has since been translated into 4 languages. In 2009, he won the Delphic Laurel for his poem, Songbird, a Bellagio Rockefeller Fellow and a juror for the Nigeria Prize for Literature. He also translates poetry into Yoruba. He participates in this fall residency thanks to a grant from the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. Playwright Nick Yu is the artistic director of the Shanghai Dramatic Arts Center, the Shanghai International Comedy Festival, and co-director of the Shanghai Performing Arts Group. He has had over 60 plays produced in China and abroad. He also works in film, TV, and radio. His writing has won him the Cao Yu Script Award and an Outstanding Social Achievement Award at the Cairo International Experimental Theater Festival. His participation in the fall residency comes courtesy of the Paul and Walding Angle Memorial Fund. Next to Nick is the novelist Shadrach Chakoti, who is the founder of the Story Club in Malawi, the Kenyenyeva's Ministries, which serves vulnerable children, and the Feminart Arts and Book Festival. He also co-directs a publishing company, Pan-African Publishers. Writing in English and Chichewa, he is the author of 9 books of speculative fiction, and his novel Azotus the Kingdom won the 2013 Pergunt Literary Award. He is here courtesy of the U.S. Embassy in Lilongwe. And finally, on the very end, we have the poet Efe Dion, who teaches architectural history and theory at Mimar Sinan Arts University and co-directs the Gaziantep Poetry Festival, which last year hosted 12 poets from 8 countries. In addition to his academic publications on space and architecture and poetry, he has published 3 poetry collections, most recently Frequently Asked Questions, and his work has been translated into 29 languages. A debut novel titled Other is forthcoming, and he participates in the fall residency courtesy of the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs at the U.S. State Department. As is our custom, the writers will present presentations and abstracts of their thinking, and then we'll open it up to questions. Is that it?
Thank you. It's a pleasure and honor to be with you. Before I read what I prepared, I thought I might open by saying that among the Yoruba, there are 2 primary kingdoms, the Ife kingdom and the Oyo kingdom. The Ife kingdom is a spiritual kingdom. They make all the artworks that you see in the museums around the world. The Oyo kingdom is the warlike kingdom. But the Oyo have a tradition. If a monarch gets too powerful, the elders send him a message, a parrot's egg, and the interpretation is he has to commit suicide. Now, why not a chicken's egg or any other egg? The reason is a parrot mimics. There's a particular parrot in this city that speaks 4 languages from 4 continents, but he only mimics. And that is the people's way of saying to the king, no, we don't want to mimic you. We want our own speech. So, thank you. Idi Amin, one of the most notorious autocrats in the history of Uganda, once said that freedom of speech was guaranteed in his country, but he could not guarantee freedom after speech. You can see him playing with words even in the midst of. This sadly summarizes the situation in many countries in contemporary Africa and the rest of the modern world, even today. In the past, policing speech was limited to state actors. In the contemporary world, multinational corporations, religious fanatics, and ethnic irredentists have all joined the ranks of those seeking to police speech. Because speech is so closely allied with thought, there's always the risk of virulent speech, the most dangerous form of which is hate speech. Truly, speech becomes most dangerous when it threatens people for belonging to a specific group and treats humanity the way humanity treats snakes, mosquitoes, and other pests. Words can do more than break bones and end lives. This is a fact played out in the many theaters of history. In Africa, one way in which hate speech has manifested itself over the centuries is to describe people in terms usually reserved for insect or cold-blooded animals, and even the rare mammals, such as the rat. History has taught us that whenever any part of humanity is described in terms of cockroaches, snakes, or rats, some monstrosity lies in wait around the corner. Such was the case in Rwanda in 1994, and in South Africa for almost 300 years. While the most extreme forms of hate speech are now subject to severe legal sanctions, it is also true that the forms taken by hate speech have evolved and continue to evolve. Political populism has ensured that Orwellian doublespeak is alive and well and taking root in ostensibly democratic countries around the world. The danger is not academic. Indeed, wherever humanity finds itself on the planet, and even in outer space, this corruption of language is a real threat. If we need any reminders of the true power of hate speech, we can readily remember the gruesome manner in which the journalist Jamal Khashoggi was butchered by operatives from the government of his own country on foreign soil. We can consult the improbable list of banned but important books across the world. To Kill a Mockingbird is still banned in some places. Or we can look away. But really, looking away is not an option. Articulation is one of the few distinguishing factors that separates humankind from other life forms on planet Earth. With speech, humanity has civilized itself, created song and poetry, the very things that artificial intelligence, no matter how advanced, cannot create. To attack free speech is therefore to attack the touchstone of human culture. Those who argue against free speech do so knowing two things. One, those who are denied speech are not citizens but mere objects. And two, denial of free speech is not sustainable long-term. Africa has taught the world many lessons, but perhaps the most urgent lesson at this time is that every society needs conscientious objectors and whistleblowers who must be protected. This is what we can do to support free speech. We can support broader education in human cultures while attacking the logic that produces hate speech in the first place. The logic of extraction without compensation, of use without regard for dignity, of the corruption of capitalism and individual freedoms, the divorce of socialism from human responsibilities. We can insist on an end to the continued preservation of criminal defamation laws on the statute books and codes. We can seek an increase in state resources channeled towards ensuring education for citizens for broader cultural awareness and sensitivity across borders. We can continue to champion the glorious legacy of the satire, the lampoon, the pasquinade, the comic cartoon, forms that are now in danger of extinction because of the presumption that people in power worldwide must have some form of superior wisdom. Finally, we must insist that the civis is always greater than the polis, or it ought to be, and that the sanctity of human life is recognized in every public sphere. Thank you. I did it in less than 10 minutes.
Now it's for me. In fact, I really less to read the article in English in front of so many people. That for me is somewhat, but I will try. In fact, when I arrived, I was told to write an article in English, but also the article name, the subject is Speak Freely. So writing English, how can I speak freely? If I write in Chinese, I can do that better. So I didn't write until the last day. I say I want to give me pleasure to give me more energy to write an article like this. In fact, during my writing, I always do like that. I always write on the last day. so I will try. Speaking freely, writing is the best way for me to speak freely. I was from a small village in Anhui province in East China. For so many years, only 8 families lived there. It became 7 after my family moved. Approximately, this is a difficult word for me. I tried many times. I should say that's good for me. Approximately 80 villages like this disappear every day. It's really sad in China for that, because I'm from the village. I know the village is so valuable for me, but every day that disappears like this is a really tragedy. some of which exist for hundreds of years. My father has been the headmaster and the only teacher in the village school for more than 30 years. And almost all the people from a dozen villagers had been his students, including the other teachers. Farmers who stop teaching in growing season. He taught me a lot to speak in front of people. That my father taught me, so I will try. A lot to share your opinions. Silence is golden. Hide yourself. Be a quiet man. How can I speak free aloud? In fact, I think that is the traditional Chinese culture, special in the countryside. When I was young, I always was told by my father, you cannot speak really loud. You cannot to show people your opinion. You should be really quiet and to keep calm for yourself. That is the value, but it is against when I grew up, always against for that. The village is itself spoken freely in a way I understood and loved. It gave me all kinds of flowers in spring, the bees and the butterflies, and the lotus roots, which are delicious as soon as you pull them out of the deep down and under earth. So in the summertime, when I'm in the water, I swimming, I can put the lotus out and you just eat it. It's really fresh. I always remember the smell, the taste. But when I grew up, I cannot. The smell of the rice in the wind at night. Cicadas. I'm right, cicadas. Cicadas singing in the trees, and people walking in the field under the scorching sun in summer. Autumn means picking peanuts in the fields, baking sweet potatoes after school, singing when you're riding buffalo. The whole winter, everybody prepare for Chinese New Year, displaying red couplets and the images of the door god, hanging the red lanterns, setting off the firecrackers to the scare monsters away. I found that I lost my way to speak freely when I moved to Shanghai in 1991. When I went to college to train in the rehabilitation and the hospital medicine, I did not understand the local Shanghai language and needed to use the Mandarin for writing and talking instead of my native dialect. I didn't understand the way this city is spoken until one afternoon in 1997. I was strolling down a small line in the central downtown area, lost there, the sunshine on my face, and I noticed an old man standing nearby and cracking seats. I noticed people playing cards, a woman washing the clothes underneath a basket, two children playing badminton on the street, two old ladies talking to each other through their window. Suddenly, I found a way to describe Shanghai. Even now in Shanghai, I cannot understand the Shanghai language, but I stayed there almost 30 years. But I can speak, but the Shanghainese cannot understand. That's not my fault. I quit my job as a doctor, and I found a way to speak freely in the theater. I found the possibilities for expression infinite in the theater despite the limitation of the theater space. And there, all these memories came back and became unique. In the theater, I can fly freely in the time and the space of the village where I lived before and live forever. Last year, that space ordered me to do something I thought I would never do. I wrote a traditional Chinese opera, We have more than 300 traditional Chinese operas in China. But in the 1949, when the new China rebuilt, we have more than 60, but now half disappeared. In my hometown, we had one named Lu Ju, founded by the poor people who begged for food door by door in disaster years by singing. The stories of those operas always featured the female character crying and singing from the beginning to the end about their miserable lives. But I like them very much. And my father always brought me to the opera when I was young. I never imagined that I could write one by myself, but I discovered the specificity of the style gave me the freedom to express my childhood experience. I love Ahuva City very much, even though I just arrived 1 week ago. Every day, I try to find time to take a walk along the Ahuva River. I sit on a bench by the riverside and feel the peace. Suddenly, I hear the crickets singing around me, not only one, but many. And in such moments, I ignore the noise from cars and people, also from my brain, from my mind. I listen to the deep place of my heart, and I can feel the grass growing, the flowers blooming, the clouds rejoicing, and the air whispering. I'm floating somewhere, and somewhere maybe from the village, a small village. The crackers singing and singing. I ate them conversation. I cannot sing. Their lives, their happiness, and their joys. Yes, I think they are speaking freely. So good. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Would you turn to the person who is sitting to your right and say hi to them? And tell them, you look so good.
You look good.
Once again, thank you so much, Chris, and everyone. I'll just dive into this. So I recently posted this on my Facebook wall, and this is what I said. As a writer, sometimes my character will say things that I personally cannot say. They will go to places I am not allowed to go. Sometimes they will do things, or they do things that I would never do in my whole life. Therefore, when my character is swearing, it is not I who swears, because I'm just a messenger. Now, the post generated all sorts of comments, and here's a highlight on a few of those. Person A said, in short, characters have their own legal personalities, like they can sue and be sued. And there was one thinking face emoji, and 3 I can't stop laughing emojis. Now, person B said, I always have this fear about the readers here, whether they would understand that it's the character saying and doing things and not necessarily the writer. And person C said, you are one with your characters. Otherwise, how can a mango tree bear bananas? And I think this was the most interesting comment to me. Person D said, as a writer, you are a parent to your characters. It is your responsibility to punish them as a father. Simply put, you can't run away from responsibility when your characters misbehave. And then he put a red, angry face emoji. Now, I come from a country that is very restrictive when it comes to freedom of speech. Not necessarily because of politics or laws, as is the case with most African countries, but because of social norms. For 30 years, we were under the totalitarian rule of Dr. Kamuzu Banda, an infamous leader who was notoriously quick in silencing people of dissenting views. During his reign, many writers were arrested. Jack Mabanje for his poetry book of Chameleons and Gods. Samu Mpasu for his novel Nobody's Friend. And one of my friends, Mr. Jinoko, for his poem Come, Come and Mend, and many others. But in 1992, we rose up as a nation, took to the streets, and ousted Dr. Banda, ushering in a period of democracy, freedom of speech, respect for the rule of law, human rights, and unfortunately also a period of corruption. Politically, once we embraced democracy, anybody could write anything in whatever manner they wanted. We had all the freedom to truly speak. In our society, and to most writers, this freedom, though, was mostly exercised in the political arena, since you could now criticize the government without fear of facing a jail sentence. That said, not long ago, a friend of mine wrote a story that depicted two boys who were madly in love. The internet in my country was set ablaze, with people accusing him of being irresponsible and an irresponsible writer who had no respect for the cultural norms of our society. I wrote a story almost 2 decades ago about a Christian boy. By the way, I'm very religious, well-behaved, very principled, who was enticed to watch porn with a girl, ended up sleeping with her, enjoying the sex, and asking himself, why did I come this late to the party? Again, my Christian friends accused me and told me to my face that my story was demonic and from the pit of hell. I was betraying the cross, they said. My daughter is an avid reader and writer. She reads almost everything that I write, and she's excited with that. She's already writing poetry and amazing stories, especially of speculative fiction. Recently, she asked me, Dad, have you started writing your virtual reality story yet? Yep, I answered. Please, read me a little. She said, I can't. It's still in Chichewa. I'll read it to you after translation. I said. I lied. My story starts in a bar with a character who is preoccupied with his attempts to impress a prostitute and his desire to get some quickie. I did not want my daughter to hear that. So as a writer and an individual, I am a free soul with the freedom to write whatever I want in whatever manner. But sometimes I do catch myself asking the question, what if my daughter reads this? What are my friends going to think about this and me? How about my religion? And in many cases, my answer has been to middle finger all these restrictions so that I can be true to my stories and my characters. But sometimes, my answer has been to abandon some of this freedom willingly in order to be a responsible father or citizen or member of my church. Sometimes freedom feels at odds with my affiliations. Thank you.
So for thousands of years, political theorists have proposed various utopic proposals and politicians have tried to realize them. Which one of them can claim to equal the freedom that arts provide? Many politicians suggested that art should follow their lead to put to use its promise of expression of freedom. But if it is the arts which offer the ultimate space for freedom, then it is the politicians who need to follow the artist's lead, to learn from them, to take them as role models. And maybe it is the society which supports, elaborates, and aspires art as the foremost reason of its existence. Our conception of the relationship between art and society needs to be reversed by reformulating the question of is art for art's sake or for society's sake? What better solution can be found to reverse an idea than rewriting its arguments with its own words? Isn't every argument a response to another one? So I am going to read a few excerpts from one of the forgery texts under the title of Society for Art's Sake, written for this panel series. So I forged a manifesto text written by André Breton and Leon Trotsky by simply replacing every word related to art with another word related to politics and vice versa. So you can see here both texts. The text on the upper line is the text forged by me, and the one in the gray is the original one. So towards a free artistic politics forged by Efe Duyan. We can say, without exaggeration, that never before has art culture been menaced so seriously as today. The Vandals, with instruments which were barbarous and so comparatively ineffective, blotted out the art culture of the antiquity in one corner of Europe. But today, we see world art culture united in its historic destiny, reeling under the blows of the reactionary forces armed with the entire arsenal of modern technology. We are by no means thinking only of the world war that draws near. Even in times of peace, the position of politics and science has become absolutely intolerable. Insofar as it originates with an individual, insofar as it brings into play subjective talents to create something which brings about an objective enriching of artistic legacy. Any philosophical, sociological, scientific, or ideological discovery seems to be the fruit of precious change, that is to say, the manifestation, more or less spontaneous, of necessity. Such creations cannot be slighted, whether from the standpoint of general inspiration, which interprets the existing world, or of moments of epiphany, which, to change the art world for the more diverse, requires an exact experience of the self-image which governs its movement. Specifically, we cannot remain indifferent to the emotional means under which ideological activity takes place. Nor should we fail to pay all respect to those, to this respectfulness to others, which govern the practical change. In the contemporary art world, we must recognize that the ever more widespread destruction of those emotional means under which changing the world is possible. From this follows of necessity an increasingly manifest degradation not only of politics, but also of the specifically political personality. The regime of the assertive, now that it has rid his environment of all those activists whose work expressed the slightest sympathy for artistic liberty, however superficial, has reduced those who still consent to take up pen or brush to the statues of domestic servants or the assertive artistic propaganda, whose task it is to glorify it on order, according to the worst possible doctrinal conventions. The existing forms of expression, not the artistic perspective of the self, here comes a correction, working through the so-called art legacy organizations it controls in other surroundings, has spread over the entire world a deep twilight hostile to every sort of spiritual value, a twilight of filth and blood in which, disguised as intellectuals and activists, those men steep themselves who have made servility a career, of lying for pay a custom, and of the palliation of crime a source of pleasure. The official politics of the omniscientism mirrors with a blatancy unexampled in art history their efforts to put a good face on their mercenary profession. So the aim of this appeal is to find a common ground on which may be reunited all empathetic opposition and activists who love art, the better to serve the art culture by their politics, and to defend the liberty that society itself against the usurpers of the liberated arts. We believe that political, philosophical, and aesthetic tendencies of the most varied sort can find here a common ground. Free-form supporters can march here hand in hand with protesters, provided both parties uncompromisingly reject the reactionary police patrol spirit represented by the omniscience and their henchmen, the Stooges. Thank you very much.
It was a dazzling set of presentations, and I must say, Nick, that when I first traveled to Shanghai with Nie Waling, she found it, she couldn't understand anybody there either, and she found that hysterically funny to never understand the people there, so you're in good company. So we'll open it up to questions now from the audience. And Lee, who has done such exemplary work on helping the writers to edit this for English presentation, I want to thank you, but she has the microphone, and Natasha is here ready to fire away.
Thank you. So, yeah, great set of papers, and as usual, the range is wide, and the strategies to tackle this controversial topic are diverse. I still would like to pursue the question of whether you would, under what circumstances hate speech can, whether there is such a thing as hate speech in your register, and whether what the consequences of such hate speech should, might, ought to be. This is obviously a European perspective. EU has a much stronger, narrower definition of hate speech than the United States. And that's a confrontation that's about to happen because of the new ruling that EU has issued with regard to internet and in particular Facebook. So the clash of the two cultures of freedom of speech are about to hit the legal system, and I would love to have a preview of your opinions there. Thank you.
Yeah, Start from the right.
Okay, so this is a very tricky question.
I was hoping.
What I can say from Nigeria is this. We have a government in place. The first thing this new head of state did was to say he was going to make a law on hate speech. Now we have at least 5 journalists, Yelesho Ore, Sahara reporters, Dadiata, who uses microblogging, and 3 others in jail, arraigned in court for an offense that does not exist on the statute books, insulting the president. Nigeria is 59 years old. We have never had it so insidious. What I can say about hate speech, and people are quick to use the example of Rwanda and how many radio stations were used to propagate a certain agenda, is that there's a logic that produces hate speech in the first place. What you find, now this is not going to apply to the Northern Hemisphere, what you find in Africa is by the time colonialists were living, whether they were Lusophone, whether they were Francophone, whether they were Anglophone, by the time they were leaving, they were careful to hand over power to the minority. Now, the problem is, I'm not a political scientist, but you can only sustain minority rule through one of 2 means or 3 means. Deception or force, or in some cases, the combination of the 2. Why it seems worldwide there's a resurgence in the clamor to have hate speech entrenched is that the populist temper of the world has moved in that direction. But I think it is more important to attack the logic that produces what people describe as hate speech. And we're actually, wherever you live in the world, we're actually going to have to confront this question that you just raised. I'm sure that if we would have a perspective on this.
Well, I'm against forbidding any kind of speech, including hate speech. Of course, there must be a reaction to hate speech, a very strong reaction, but the solution is not forbidding it. Because by forbidding something, anything, you cannot convince people. It is not a good way to convince people. But what we need is to convince people that all the ideas or the ideology behind the hate speech is not, healthy for our society. So, but you cannot convince people by forbidding them. You would push them to the underground. So I would say, I think all kinds of speech should be really, really free, including hate speech.
So I think practically for me, in my writing, I give a lot of my attention to to characters and how they develop the story. When I'm writing, maybe the first draft or the second draft, I don't think about all these restrictions. Sometimes maybe hate speech might find its way in there, but it's the characters doing it and not me. But usually, like when I've written and I've sent it to friends, these are some of the things that I would, want them to point out or to look for, because my process of writing is really to be free and to write whatever and think whatever is in connection with the characters and with the story. And maybe if there's a character who gives into hate speech, maybe it might be important for him to say those things in the context of the story. So practically, I think that's what I do. But also to realize that there's freedom, but there's also the issue of responsibility. You have to be responsible. Yeah.
Okay, might I add something? there's a couplet from England that I like. It goes thus: "Persuade a man against his will, he's of the same opinion still." I think it was Gladstone who said that. You have a time bomb on your hands. I actually understand why some legislation restricts speech, especially what is described as hate speech, because we now know that you don't need guns to carry out genocide. Over nearly 2 million people that were killed in Rwanda were killed with machetes. However, I insist that it's a more fruitful venture to attack the logic that produces, that incites people to. Because are you saying that some people are children of lesser gods? That's what really angers people, what makes them, especially in Africa.
Yeah. In fact, the way I try to understand the question, I can't. But when they answer so much, I still cannot. So maybe you can help me. What is the yeah, in Chinese it will be fine. 不是，你就剩下那个他的。
他的意思就是说，煽动仇恨言论和言论自由之间的关系如何处理？就是如果在写作中或者是日常生活中有这个煽动仇恨的言论，怎么处理和自由写作之间的关系
Okay, I will try. When I write something, I think I should be freedom to write anything. But in China, sometimes when you can write, but for example, in the theater, when I write the play scripts, but most of it can put on stage, but some that cannot be on the stage. So I can try to write freely. But for the hate speech, I really hate hate speech. You know why? but I think that is not a question for me. So that's all.
I'm sure Malawi has many things to teach us.
Hi, this is a question about the differences in reading, writing, and hearing. So are there passages from your novels or work that you would hesitate speaking in front of an audience, whereas in a book, when you write, your audience is invisible, so you feel a little bit more freedom?
No, for me, there is no difference. It is both ways is public. So when I can write something, I can also, talk about it.
I think with me it depends with the audience. You know, there are some sections, for example, in my novel that I can't read to children. Actually, until now, I have forbidden my daughter to read my novel until when she's 18. But you know, so my writing process is different from my reading process. I really have to, gauge or understand the audience and see if the text is going to be relevant or not.
As I understand, that is not a question for me, because I'm a playwright. All I write should be for audience. So no problem.
I love how Shadrick's daughter has become a character in this.
Yes, so I think the quality of education of the public and their skill at grasping concepts is very important. One of the problems with Uganda under Idi Amin, for example, was that he was a man of such limited range. He was a good boxer, he was a good footballer, but he had no clue how political thinking is conducted. In Nigeria, we were unlucky for almost 30 years to have this particular set of autocrats who really targeted writers. I mean, this guy sent scholars to Argentina, to Chile, to study how to read texts. So it became really dangerous to be a writer. I mean, Wole Soyinka almost died in solitary confinement. We are lucky he survived. He became Nobel laureate, but easily he could have died. Now I think the climate in my country is slightly different because we have autocrats who are not as clever. So who don't read newspapers, who don't read books. The only time they would take you into custody is if they see a cartoon that depicts them in a light they don't like. Yeah, that's the only time. So, yeah, public education is critical.
I have for example, in fact, I write the play script, but I need to read the play script in front of the audience. Also in front of all the group, includes the director, the actor. I just threw the play script to them. They will do the rehearsal and they put on the stage. But after almost 20 years later, I find I must read my script in front of all of them. I spend almost maybe 2 or 3 days to talk with all the actors and the directors, the designers, let them to know what I want to do, what I want to write. Let them not really to change my play script. So that's what I do 20 years later, not before, yeah.
I was wondering if you feel any limits, not from outside forces, but from internal aspects, like the characters or the plot or the subject. Are there things that you feel that you can or can't write down because the characters wouldn't agree or it doesn't fit the plot or those things? Thanks.
So the internal policeman, he's ever present. I'm sorry, I wish I was stronger, bolder, more willing to cross borders and transgress. But each time I do it, the strange thing is I have friends who are in the academy in the US. They quickly write me a note. Don't you know they are going to read it? And I check myself. However, poetry is a good way to get away with saying everything. Because I know they're clever, but they're not that clever.
That makes me think that when Yu Hua was here, and they banned the film of To Live that Zheng Yimou filmed, I asked Yu Hua if they were going to ban if they banned his book as well, and he said no, they don't really know how to read.
Aesthetic education is very expensive.
Well, yeah, it's a dilemma sometimes. This inner censorship, it exists, not only in terms of politics, but also, like Sharik does, you think that the people close to you will also read these stuff that you write, and you also think what they will think about it afterwards. Yeah, it's I think one of the struggles that a writer should try to overcome. But usually my experience is, as Tade said, if you are bold enough to overcome this inner censorship, it is always a better text that comes out. So bolder means better.
as I said, when I try to write, I never think something I cannot write. I just write to express what I want to do. But when in the operate process, there's always a problem in China. In fact, in China, we have the censorship, but the censorship have a lot of the meaning to the artists, to the writers. Sometimes you can just say that is a game. Sometimes you need to fight with them. Sometimes that is not by the law. That is just by somebody who sits there. There is an official. You need to talk with them. In my writing, I have I don't know, but maybe 8 or 9 the place with this kind of problem. But I think the censorship in China, they need to be changed. Also in the different period have the different things. But I think that is brings the big problem for us is the self-censorship. I was organized the theater to talk with a lot of the playwright, to artists to work with our theater. Mostly when I talk with them, they will think the first things, I cannot write this, I cannot do this, I cannot do that. It's not think I can't do that, I can't do that. So I always to talk with my colleague to say we must fight with that. We cannot to be censorship by ourselves. That we will be dead. So that's what I think. Yeah.
I think for me, I think the key word is to willingly, abandon some of the freedoms or the freedoms because I want to be responsible. So the key word is to do that with. So I'm not forced. I can do it if I want to, but I, do that with my will to abandon some of the, some of the freedoms to be politically correct and all that. And I think that's freedom also to abandon your freedom is also freedom in a sense. I don't feel restricted in terms of expression and all that. I don't feel restricted, but I feel that I also have that power to abandon all or to use it. I think I can express more than that. But at every level, I think of your writing, there is that conflict of choice. Of the words you're going to use, the characters you're going to use. In what manner you're going to present them. It's in as much as you're free, you're also struggling with all these questions in terms of how you're going to present that to maybe to your readers or to yourself. I don't know if that, yeah.
I think that's a wonderful place for us to stop because the protest is just beginning. And I want to quickly mention a couple of things before you leave. Please look for current and past participants at the book festival this weekend. Amanda Lee Ko is in town from Singapore. There's a film featuring Boris Gregorich as well as Chuck Miller screening this afternoon, and a reading on Sunday of work by Bejan Matur, as well as a slate of panels tomorrow afternoon featuring current IWP writers. This afternoon at 5 o'clock, our Shanghai House reading will feature Takako Arai and Wallace Nokan. Sunday at 4 o'clock at Prairie Lights, we'll have Yamkela Tiwakadi and Ben Sohib, and as well as Chamini Kulathunga from the translation workshop. And that night, at 7 o'clock at the Film Scenes Ped Mall location, Amira Kalfala will be hosting a screening of her own short film, Miss, followed by Gilan Pantakovo's 1966 classic, The Battle of Algiers. Big thanks to our great panel.